Hi, my name is Sevilla, and I'm a big fan of card games. I have been in the competitive sphere of TCG since 1999, and I have found myself really liking Elestrals overall as a game. Which is why the topic of this video is so hard to talk about, but I think it's necessary to have Elestrals expand, especially in the major areas of the United States. The fact of the matter is, being a competitor on the West Coast for Elestrals right now absolutely sucks. I believe I have boiled it down to the three biggest reasons why, and I hope we can address those and find a solution to improve the situation. Number 1. No store wants to give Elestrals a chance. This perspective doesn't come from me living in a small town. I live in Seattle, the biggest city in Washington, with one of the pillars of the card game industry, Mock's Boarding House, in my backyard, as well as a myriad of other different card shops I can get to within 30 minutes from where I live. And not a single one of them is willing to take a chance on Elestrals. At the time of this recording, there's only one shop that hosts Elestrals tournaments in my entire state, which is 5 hours away closer to Idaho than it is Seattle. And that local has Sir Tractor, who is not a small name in the community. But even they said they were struggling, and they're the only LGS who even has Elestrals right now in Washington. I cannot say how big the player base is at the Clarkson local, as I do not live there, but I doubt they have as big as a TCG install base as I do here in Seattle. Because of the current state of how antagonistic these stores are being towards Elestrals, not because they want to be, but because they just can't take the financial risk, it means that it's really hard to find product just within a couple days before a premiere event happens. Meaning that we're completely reliant on both the Elestrals Marketplace Discord and the Discord in general, just for any semblance of competitive play on Elestrals. Which leads to number 2. Not having enough access to cards immediately, and the fact that events are antagonistic towards the time zones in the West Coast means that it's really hard to be a competitive player on the West. I entered last weekend's premiere, and because I had no access to livestream cards before I knew I was going to compete, I couldn't play the deck I wanted to play at full capacity. I did not play with this disadvantage by choice, but because it was the only way I could play in the premiere event. Without an LGS selling singles, or even like a big box store or an LGS selling the sealed product, I couldn't just go and buy a livestream structure to pick up the last like Alrune cards I needed and like a Lunar Eclipse full moon to be able to play the deck I wanted to play at full capacity. In Seattle, we're currently completely reliant on the online retailers, the TCG players, the Bean Soldiers, loot level cards, 50 cards, those kind of vendors, and you're just stuck waiting on shipping, and you just pray a ban list doesn't get announced before your cards get in. This was not the first time I wanted to compete in Premiere. I've been trying to enter Premiere 4 other times, and every other time, I would get cards in, and they would a ban list would be announced, they'd get banned, and then I just could not play in the Premiere anymore. The biggest example is when I bought a Lunar Eclipse Full Moon for $35, and 2 days right after I bought the card and it was getting shipped out, Like a Void just got sent to Tartarus, meaning that 6 of the singles I just bought to be able to finally actually play the deck I wanted to play at like the current power level was completely gone. Like, I just could not play the game anymore. 6 of these cards in my deck were worthless now and just didn't do anything. And because we're reliant on getting the product from online, it means I'd have to wait even longer to get more singles to play, meaning the premiere's already over. So you're just constantly burning money on singles from the marketplace, from vendors and stuff, and you're basically just playing a gacha game, saying like either your cards are going to be worthless or they'll be banned before you can even play them. Bar access to cards being an issue, the premiere events themselves are also an issue, because on the West Coast that means you're starting at 6 a.m. And I would understand if it was like, oh, but that's for like, a big quote-unquote like regional style event, right? But we have no locals, meaning the premiere events are our locals. So we're getting up at 6 a.m. to play in a local twice a month. And it isn't cheap because it's $30 after tax. So you're spending $60 every month to basically play a 7-round locals that starts at 6 a.m. And that's just not very sustainable for us on the West Coast at the moment. There was a client that helped alleviate this for a long time, but in its current state, it's also the third reason why we're struggling out here. Number 3. The state of Clash. For a moment, Clash was a great representation of what modern Elestrals looked like. The meta was very similar to what the actual metagame in the TCG was, and it was easy just to boot up Clash, play some games, and feel like you were getting somewhere in practice. But right now, Clash in its current state feels like it's 3 formats behind, meaning it's no longer a current representation of what the meta looks like, and just getting on Clash to practice for the TCG is no longer a viable option. The lack of livestream cards and being updated towards the current ban list means that there's no reason for me to get on Clash to practice for Premier events. And while Clash will never be a true one-to-one to the TCG, it will at least at a moment, I could play the exact same deck on Clash as I could in paper, and practice my deck on Clash to be better about it mechanically so I felt more prepared for a Premier event. And by the time that livestream finally does make it to Clash, Daybreak meta might already be here and the format is just going to change again. And while I do appreciate the Law Yu-Gi-Oh for making ClashNet to help alleviate this sort of issue to have a manual client in the vein of Dueling Book, it's basically still locked behind a Discord, so now we're just relying on more Discords again. It makes me worried that the Elestrals team are spreading themselves too thin before really locking in and fixing the issues with Clash. This is not an attack on Adrive or the team behind Elestrals, because I wouldn't be making this video if it didn't come from a place of love for the game, but I believe focusing on Elestrals Awakened in the middle of having these issues with Clash and not having Elestrals be fully established might have been a little backwards in my priorities. And I know Dan's at work trying to fix the first issue that I've had with Elestrals, trying to incentivize shops to finally break in, but I'm worried that we might be a little too far behind with the state that Clash is currently left in, and it might be a little too late for Elestrals to fully get off the ground in the West. But I have some ideas that I think would help solve the issues. Number 1. Allowing stores to proxy at the local level. This would be helpful twofold. A, it would let us run Elestrals at stores that don't have any product and not have to invest in it before they could see if they have a player base. And it would let the competitive players actually test before getting their hands on product. It would help gauge interest long term in those stores. And I'm not asking to make like counterfeit cards, but just some printable way of having playtest cards on play.elestrals would go such a long way for being able to test for events, seeing if you need to make last minute changes, and be way easier to fire events because now you don't need established product to be able to be like, hey, let's fire an 8-man, and if you have multiple decks just like already placed tested up, you can get way more people interested in the game that way. Especially as a new set drops and it's harder to get cards for, like it is for livestream with us. Number 2, Clash needs to be a priority again. Not just for the West Coast, but for Elestrals as a front-facing TCG in general. Clash in its current state right now is sad. If we had a proper spectator mode, we were updated fully to the current meta, we could have so many digital events going on to help alleviate the locals that just don't have the space for paper play, and we would get more eyes on the game because more people would be making content. And number 3, Premier events are really expensive for the areas that don't have locals, and we need a constructed weekly local online to compensate. Something in between the casual Tuesday events and the Premier, like a $5 event where the winner gets 10 Worlds points in a booster pack, would go so far in helping expand the game in the areas that it's currently struggling. Those, I think, are the 3 biggest things that would help Elestrals, but I do have a couple of wishlist items that I would hope to have to make Elestrals more accessible overall. The first is that we don't have enough online retailers. We do have a handful, but I wish we had more bigger retailers in the space of like a Cool Stuff Inc., a Card Kingdom, a Core TCG, some of the bigger players that would be able to sell the product for singles, just to mean we have more access to those cards in other areas as well. Especially Core TCG in the West Coast, since they're such a prime player in our area. The other, I think, is that Elestrals could really benefit from like a trainer toolkit style product where you would get 2 copies of every rune that's playable in the meta currently. So that way you could buy 1 structure and 1 trainer's toolkit, and for like $40 you could have a competent deck that you feel like you're prepared to play in a Premier event with. I'm sorry if this video came off super negative or pessimistic, but like I said before, it comes from a place of love. I really like Elestrals, to the point where I would make it my main game if some of these issues were fixed. But until they are, it can't be my main focus. I will try to make events where I can, but hopefully in the future, there'll be a Premier event in Washington like a regional. That completely changes the tide of the core issues I have with the game right now. Thank you everybody for watching. I've been Sevilla, and I'll see you in the next video.